Most Canadians view their boycotts on U.S. goods and travel as temporary, but nearly half say they will outlast the Trump White House.
What if a quiet decision made in Canadian grocery aisles is now inflicting billions of dollars in damage on United States agriculture, threatening farm incomes, food prices, and trade stability across North America? At first glance, this does not look like a traditional trade war. There are no emergency press conferences, no formal sanctions announced overnight, and no new tariffs signed into law. Yet across Canada, particularly in British Columbia, a powerful economic shift is unfolding, one driven not by governments, but by consumers. Canadian shoppers are increasingly turning away from American agricultural products. With United States soybeans emerging as a focal point, retailers are quietly reducing exposure to U.S. suppliers. Importers are reassessing contracts. Shipments once considered routine are now being questioned, delayed, or redirected. For the United States, this matters far more than it may appear. Soybeans are not a niche export. They're one of the most valuable agricultural commodities in the American economy, supporting farmers, transport networks, processors, and rural communities across multiple states. When demand weakens, the consequences cascade quickly: lower prices, shrinking margins, and rising financial stress in the Farm Belt. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that consumer boycotts do not operate on diplomatic timelines. They are slow to build, but even slower to reverse. And this is only the beginning. What is happening in Canadian grocery stores today has the potential to lock the United States out of a trusted export market for years, triggering losses that no tariff rollback or political apology can easily undo. Stay with us to the end, because what we reveal next explains how this quiet boycott could become one of the most damaging and underestimated fronts of the current trade war. The first shockwave from Canada's consumer pullback does not appear in headlines. It appears in balance sheets. Across the Midwest and Northern Plains, soybean farmers in the United States are already operating under narrow margins shaped by volatile commodity prices, rising fertilizer costs, and elevated interest rates. When export demand weakens even slightly, those margins compress fast. Soybeans are not a secondary crop. They account for roughly 9 out of every 10 oilseed acres planted in the United States. And they sit at the center of an integrated system that includes crushing facilities, animal feed producers, biofuel inputs, and export terminals. When Canada reduces its intake, surplus soybeans do not simply disappear. They remain inside the domestic market, increasing supply and applying downward pressure on prices nationwide. Agricultural economists note that price declines triggered by export losses tend to overshoot initially. Buyers wait, futures markets react. Farmers who stored crops in anticipation of stronger prices are forced to sell into a softer market. For producers carrying operating loans, even a modest price decline can determine whether a season ends with a profit or a loss. The consequences extend beyond the farm. Rural equipment dealers delay sales. Grain elevators face storage bottlenecks. Trucking firms see fewer contracted routes. Local banks grow more cautious, tightening credit for small agricultural businesses. In many counties, soybean revenue supports schools, infrastructure bonds, and healthcare access. When farm income falls, entire communities feel the contraction. This is why policymakers historically treated agricultural exports as politically sensitive assets during any trade war. The damage concentrates geographically and socially, hitting regions that have fewer economic alternatives. And unlike manufacturing, agriculture does not pivot quickly. A farmer cannot retool acreage overnight in response to shifting foreign sentiment. What makes the current situation more dangerous than previous disputes is that this pressure is not coming from formal tariffs alone. It is coming from consumers and retailers making long-term sourcing decisions. These decisions bypass negotiation tables entirely. And that leads to a deeper problem, one that goes far beyond soybeans. Traditional tariffs can be removed with a signature. Consumer trust cannot. Once retailers in Canada adapt their supply chains, the economic logic changes permanently. Alternative suppliers are tested, logistics are adjusted. Branding shifts away from United States origin labeling. Over time, the absence of American products becomes normal. From an economic perspective, this functions like a shadow tariff. There's no tax line item, but the effect is similar. United States exporters face higher barriers to re-entry, reduce shelf space, and increase marketing costs just to regain lost ground. Even if tariffs are lifted tomorrow, the demand may not return. History shows that once buyers diversify successfully, they rarely concentrate again. South American suppliers, domestic Canadian producers, and blended sourcing models gain a foothold. Price competition becomes tougher, not easier. The United States loses not just volume, but pricing power. This is particularly dangerous in a trade war environment where multiple markets are already under strain. If Canada proves that consumer-led disengagement works without severe domestic disruption, the model becomes replicable. Other allies watching this dispute may draw their own conclusions about how to respond to political friction without triggering formal retaliation. Inside Washington, this raises an uncomfortable question. How does a government counteract a market response it does not control? There is no legal mechanism to compel foreign consumers to buy American goods. There is no subsidy large enough to restore trust once it is gone. And now, a far more consequential risk is emerging. If soybeans can be quietly sidelined, what happens when this behavior spreads beyond agriculture into manufactured goods, energy inputs, or services? Because if that threshold is crossed, the United States will not be facing a temporary trade dispute. It will be facing a structural shift in how Canada and its partners engage with American markets. And the next phase of this story reveals why that shift could accelerate faster than anyone in Washington is prepared for. From a Canadian perspective, this moment is not driven by ideology alone. It is driven by arithmetic. Canada's agricultural and consumer markets are smaller than those of the United States, but they are also more flexible. When Canadian retailers and importers reassess sourcing decisions, they do so with a strategic objective: reduce dependency without triggering domestic shortages or runaway inflation. The soybeans illustrate this logic clearly. Canada is not only an importer, it is also a producer. Domestic soybean acreage has expanded steadily over the past decade, particularly in Ontario and Quebec. At the same time, Canadian importers have existing relationships with suppliers in South America, where soybean production is scaled aggressively and export infrastructure is already oriented toward North American demand. This gives Canada room to maneuver. Even partial substitution reduces reliance on United States suppliers and strengthens bargaining leverage. For retailers, diversification lowers political risk. For policymakers, it signals resilience. For consumers, it reinforces the perception that alternatives exist and that disengagement carries manageable costs. Crucially, Canada does not need to eliminate United States imports entirely to inflict economic pressure. A shift of 10 or 15% in sourcing is often enough to alter price dynamics and weaken exporter confidence. That is the threshold at which suppliers begin offering discounts, absorbing losses, or exiting the market altogether. This is why Canadian officials have been careful not to frame the situation as a formal boycott. There are no sweeping bans, no emergency regulations. Instead, the market is allowed to adjust organically. The result is pressure without escalation, impact without confrontation. From a policy standpoint, this is a disciplined response in a trade war environment dominated by uncertainty and retaliation cycles. It preserves diplomatic flexibility while still delivering measurable economic consequences. But the significance of Canada's move extends well beyond bilateral trade. What Canada is demonstrating is a model that other countries are studying closely. In a world shaped by tariffs, sanctions, and supply chain weaponization, consumer-led disengagement offers a quieter alternative. It avoids legal challenges at the World Trade Organization. It avoids immediate countermeasures, and it operates below the threshold of formal retaliation. For the United States, this is a strategic vulnerability. American trade policy is traditionally focused on state actors and regulatory tools. It is well equipped to negotiate tariff schedules and dispute panels. It is far less equipped to respond when private markets recalibrate on their own. If Canada succeeds in reducing exposure to United States goods without severe domestic disruption, the precedent matters. Other allied economies may conclude that political leverage does not require formal sanctions. It requires patience, signaling, and consumer alignment. This is especially relevant in sectors where the United States depends on reputation and reliability rather than pure price advantage. Agricultural commodities, branded food products, and intermediate goods are all sensitive to origin perception. Once that perception shifts, it becomes a long-term handicap. For American exporters, this raises the cost of political volatility. Buyers begin pricing in reputational risk, contracts shorten, long-term commitments weaken, even loyal partners hedge. Inside Washington, this dynamic is still underestimated. Political leaders often assume that close allies will return once tensions cool. Markets do not operate on sentiment alone. They operate on habit, infrastructure, and trust. And trust, once disrupted, does not reset automatically. The most troubling implication is this: if consumer-driven disengagement becomes normalized as a response to political rhetoric, then future trade wars will no longer be confined to tariffs and treaties. They will unfold in grocery aisles, procurement offices, and brand decisions that governments cannot directly influence. Which brings us to the most consequential question of all. If this strategy proves effective for Canada, what happens when it is applied not selectively, but systematically? Because the next stage of this story is not about soybeans. It is about whether the United States is prepared for a world where market loyalty is no longer assumed and where the costs of miscalculation compound quietly year after year. The impact of Canada's pullback does not stop at the farm gate. In the United States, agriculture is deeply interconnected with manufacturing, energy, transportation, and finance. When soybean exports weaken, the shock travels outward through layers of the economy that rarely appear in political speeches but matter enormously in practice. Soybeans feed an industrial ecosystem. Crushing plants convert them into meal for livestock and oil for food processing and fuel blending. Rail operators, river barges, and port terminals depend on predictable export volumes to maintain efficiency. When demand from Canada softens, utilization rates fall, fixed costs remain, margins compress. This is how localized export losses become national economic drag. Fewer shipments mean fewer hours for transport workers. Lower throughput affects processing jobs. Equipment manufacturers feel the slowdown when farmers delay or cancel purchases. These effects accumulate quietly, quarter by quarter, weakening growth in regions already vulnerable to economic shocks. There is also a fiscal dimension. When farm incomes decline, reliance on federal support programs increases. Crop insurance payouts rise. Emergency assistance becomes politically unavoidable. The cost is absorbed by taxpayers nationwide, spreading the burden far beyond agricultural states. In other words, a consumer decision made in Canada does not stay in Canada. It alters budget priorities in Washington and redistributes economic stress across the United States. This reality exposes a contradiction in modern trade war thinking. Tariffs are often defended as tools to protect domestic industries. But when retaliation bypasses tariffs entirely and strikes demand directly, the protective logic collapses. There is no tariff shield against a buyer who simply chooses another supplier. And this leads to a deeper structural concern. For decades, the United States benefited from being viewed as the default supplier in North American trade. Reliability, scale, and political alignment gave American exporters pricing power. Buyers tolerated small price differences because switching costs were high and trust was established. That advantage is now under pressure. When Canadian buyers diversify successfully, they weaken the United States' position not only in volume but in negotiation. American exporters must compete harder on price, accept shorter contracts, and offer concessions that were previously unnecessary. Over time, this erodes profitability even if some market share is retained. This is the hidden cost of consumer-driven retaliation. It does not produce a single dramatic collapse. It produces a long decline in leverage. Each contract renegotiated under pressure resets expectations lower. Each alternative supplier tested reduces dependency further. In a prolonged trade war environment, this matters enormously. The United States cannot assume that allies will absorb volatility indefinitely. Markets adapt, habits change, infrastructure follows demand. What makes this particularly dangerous is that these shifts often become visible only after they are entrenched. By the time policymakers recognize the scale of the problem, exporters are already fighting uphill battles to regain relevance. This is why economists warn that the greatest damage from trade disputes is rarely measured in the first year. It appears later, when former customers no longer feel compelled to return. And now, an even more unsettling possibility is entering the conversation. If Canada's approach proves economically sustainable and politically effective, it may not remain limited to agriculture. Because once market loyalty is broken in one sector, it becomes easier to challenge it in others. Which brings us to the final and most consequential question. Is the United States witnessing a temporary disruption or the early stages of a fundamental shift in how its closest trading partner engages with American goods? The answer lies in what happens next. What makes this moment fundamentally different from past trade disputes is that it is not being managed primarily by governments. There is no negotiation schedule, no deadline for talks, and no clear off-ramp. Instead, the pressure is emerging from the market itself, shaped by consumer sentiment, retailer risk management, and long-term procurement strategy. From a strategic standpoint, this places the United States at a disadvantage. Governments can adjust tariffs, they can issue waivers, they can announce deals, but they cannot order foreign consumers to trust American suppliers again once confidence has been shaken. Markets respond to perceived stability, not press releases. Canada's approach reflects this reality. By allowing the shift to unfold organically, Canadian policymakers avoid direct confrontation while still benefiting from reduced exposure. Over time, this transforms the bilateral relationship from one of assumed dependence to one of calculated optionality. The United States becomes one supplier among many, rather than the default choice. This is the strategic twist Washington did not anticipate. The cost to Canada is spread thinly across millions of consumers. The cost to the United States is concentrated in specific sectors, regions, and communities. That asymmetry amplifies political pressure inside the American system while keeping external tensions manageable. In a prolonged trade war, this model is far more sustainable than tit-for-tat retaliation. It reduces headline risk while increasing long-term leverage. But the implications do not stop at the border. What Canada is demonstrating is not merely resistance, it is a template. Other countries observing this dispute are learning a critical lesson. Economic influence does not always require formal sanctions or punitive tariffs. It can be exercised through consumer alignment, supply chain diversification, and reputational recalibration. For the United States, this creates a strategic dilemma. If political rhetoric continues to generate uncertainty, allies may increasingly choose disengagement over negotiation, not because it is dramatic, but because it is effective. Once this behavior becomes normalized, future trade wars will look very different. Pressure will build slowly, invisibly, and persistently. Export losses will be attributed to market conditions rather than policy decisions. Accountability will blur. Response options will narrow. This is the danger of underestimating soft power in trade. The United States has long relied on its scale and centrality to global commerce. But scale does not guarantee loyalty. Centrality does not guarantee immunity. If consumer-driven disengagement becomes a standard response to political friction, then the rules of trade enforcement change permanently. Governments lose control over the tempo and scope of economic retaliation. Markets take the lead, and once markets lead, recovery becomes slower, more expensive, and less predictable. The real shock is not that Canada is experimenting with this strategy. It is that it may work. If it does, the United States will be forced to confront a new reality, one where influence is measured not by agreements signed, but by shelves stocked and habits formed. And that brings us to the final question that this entire story has been building toward. Because what happens next will determine whether this episode fades into history or becomes a turning point in North American trade. What began as a shift in consumer behavior has evolved into a warning signal for the United States. The reaction unfolding in Canada shows how quickly economic relationships can change when trust is disrupted and alternatives are allowed to take root. This is not a story about one commodity or one season. It is about how modern trade wars are no longer fought solely through tariffs, negotiations, or treaties. The evidence is already visible. Demand softens, prices adjust, supply chains reroute, and once those adjustments stabilize, they rarely reverse fully. For American agriculture, the cost is not only measured in export figures, but in lost leverage, weakened rural economies, and increased dependence on public support to absorb private market failures. The broader implication is more sobering. If close partners can reduce reliance on United States goods without formal retaliation, then political miscalculations carry longer and deeper consequences than many policymakers anticipate. Economic power, once assumed, must now be maintained through consistency, predictability, and restraint. The question facing Washington is no longer whether tariffs can be negotiated away. It is whether confidence can be restored after markets have moved on. Because once loyalty disappears from the shelf, it does not return easily. Is this a bold strategy or a risky mistake for the United States? Subscribe for more fact-based global analysis.